Okay, so I'll start with issue 191. So this is a lot of firsts here. So it's my first issue of Dwarf, or the first issue I worked on, not the first issue that I have read. It's also the first Fat Dwarf. So this was the point that they added in a whole bunch of extra pages, added in the card sections. First issue that had Jake as editor. So Robin Deuce had been the editor before then. Jake took over for 191. So a lot of firsts coming together there. So it makes good choice for my first issue today. It was, I actually didn't have a lot of contribution to this issue. I was still learning everything. So there's very kind of little creative kind of impact that I had on this issue. I remember my very first task was proofreading the catalog pages at the back of the magazine. So, it's like, yeah, you got this great job on White Dwarf, you could be doing battle reports, and then I get there and I'm proofreading catalog pages. We didn't usually do that. Usually the catalog pages were handled by another department, but for some reason on that issue, maybe it was just to give me something to do to get me out of the way. I really don't remember, but we ended up doing the catalog pages for that one. The other really kind of big thing that happened on that issue for me, though, was I almost burnt down the studio, which would have been like a great, fantastic way to start my career. So we used to do everything ourselves in the magazine. We did like all the writing, but also all the layout work and all the photography and all the production work was done by us. And it was all kind of templated, and it was made kind of very easy for us. Like it was, we didn't have to learn how to be graphic designers or anything, but there was still a lot to learn. One of the things we had to learn was how to use the cameras. So that was one of the first things I was doing in my first couple of weeks there. I remember it was Ian Pickstock who was training me. And it was the very first time I'd been left alone in the camera studio. And we had these these big flash units, and they're surrounded by this like paper-like light diffusers. And I don't know what happened, if it was a technical problem or if I did something wrong. Probably I did something wrong, because it was my first ever time I did this by myself. No one ever blamed me, though, very nicely. I went to take a picture, and one of these flash units just exploded. And this like paper light diffuser just went up in flames. And it would have been really a disaster. Like the photography.
Yeah, that sounds terrifying.
Yeah, it was absolutely. And I had no idea what to do. I had no idea like where the fire extinguisher was, or what the fire drill was, or anything. All the terrain, the entire studio terrain collection was right next to the photography area. So that would have gone straight up as well if the fires had spread at all. And then we had all the armies, the entire miniature collection backed onto that. So, just, it would have been catastrophic, really. And I was just like literally running around, like not knowing what to do. And I had to get out because the smoke was building up, and I couldn't stay there. And then Ian came running in. I don't know where he came from, but he just came running in holding a fire extinguisher, and he goes, "Right then, where's the fire?" Which was just so Ian, huh? So he came in and extinguished the flames, and fortunately saved everybody. So that was my big memory from issue 191.
Yeah, that's an experience.
In terms of the issue itself, I think it's a great issue, but it's still, I think it shows, looking back on it, that this was our first one. It was the first time we were working together as a team. It was Jake's first time being editor. So looking back now, I see it a little rough compared to, I've got a bit more of a critical eye now, but I think it's still a great issue. And the start of really like it sounds cliche to say it, but like a golden age, right? I mean, obviously my point of view is very biased, but even if I try and look at it objectively, I think that period from kind of 191, starting with 191 through into 200s, the early 200s, early maybe even up to the mid 200s. I think was really like the best time for White Dwarf magazine. What kind of got so it was a time when Games Workshop had just gone public, of course. So we started to have there were more resources there. That's how White Dwarf managed to go, fat in the first place, having managed to get like those extra pages and card sections and everything. But there still wasn't that kind of corporate intervention coming in. There was still that kind of, the old school mentality for the design studio. We were very independent. We were on a separate site. And on the magazine, we're pretty much complete creative freedom. There would be, Robin would come and tell us, or through Jake, that there were certain things we had to do each month. This had to be covered or that had to be covered. And, everything that was like a very loose approval process. But it was essentially, the start of each month, we'd just sit together as a team and would be like, what do we want to do this month? And would throw out ideas and would come up with what we wanted to do. And it was just, we were a bunch of enthusiastic gamers doing what we loved doing and then writing about it. And I think that really shows. I think, that genuineness, that authenticity.
Yeah, absolutely. You already mentioned like the kind of golden period. That whole era kind of has a very like Wall of Cool feel to the magazine. I would say.
Yeah. That was really it, huh? So I'll move on from 191 to what was the next issue? I'm doing this is kind of like a countdown from my 5th all-time favorite issue through to my all-time favorite issue. My next one, I'm actually going to jump right back in time, like way back in time to issue 58.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is going back in time.
Yeah, it's not my first ever issue of Dwarf again, but it's one that had a really big impact on me. I think there's a lot of cool stuff back in that issue. This is back in the days of Dwarf when it was really, it wasn't a Warhammer magazine at all. It was.
They advertised all sorts, didn't they?
Yeah. And we had, there was Dungeons and Dragons articles and Call of Cthulhu articles and all kinds of stuff going on. I think it's a really nice example of all that kind of stuff. I mean, we've got I'm just looking at the features here, and there's some D&D stuff that was hugely influential on me at the time. I was playing a lot of D&D, so it's how I learned to be a dungeon master, was through White Dwarf. I think so much of gaming at the time was because there was no internet, of course. So, you couldn't just go online and look up tutorials and let's plays and see how things worked and see how people did things. The only way you could learn about stuff was through White Dwarf magazine, right? There was Dragon magazine as well, but Dragon was more of an American thing. It was kind of more expensive and harder to find in the UK. And occasionally you'd have other kind of magazines coming out, but White Dwarf was really the source for everything. So that's really like everything I was learning about gaming at the time, how to be a DM, how to play games, came from White Dwarf. And one article in particular in issue 58 really had a huge impact. So there's an article, just let me find it here. Tabletop Heroes was the name of the article by Joe Deaver and Gary Chalk. Who I think they were the authors of the Lone Wolf.
I recognize Gary. Yeah, I recognize Gary Chalk. I don't recognize the other name. I think you're right there.
I think they did the fighting fantasy game books, the Lone Wolf game books between them. But it's an article about painting minis. And it's like super basic. It's kind of like spray paint your minis, put some highlights on, think about what colors you're using. Like, it's really the kind of stuff that you get in, like you get those little free booklets that you get at Games Workshop these days, how to get started. But at the time, that was just mind-blowing. I'd never seen anything like that. Like, highlight a mini, it's like, wow. I remember at the time I was using enamel paints, like the FX enamel paints, and those would go direct onto the metal. There'd be no undercoating, flat colors. you know, big blob of white with a little speck of black in the middle for the eyes, which is as much detail as it went. So just this idea of, wow, you can do something more than that was just really like, it was transformative for me. So that's when I went out and got some acrylic paints, which even that was kind of, you know, hard to find at the time.
Yeah, it's like it's new and exciting, and it's kind of like not the norm, not been done before.
Yeah. And then undercoating a miniature. And of course, there wasn't even spray paints at the time. So it was like hand undercoating my miniature in white paint and then painting over the top of it. And it looked absolutely terrible. But it's still like, I'm sure I was very proud of it at the time. And just a huge step. And it's interesting kind of looking back at that now and seeing the minis that they show there. And it's one of the few color pages in the magazine. It was mostly black and white. And, you know, that's like what they're showing, what was kind of White Dwarf worthy, was something that, you know, you'd be hard pressed to find minis that badly painted on the internet these days. But at the time I was like, wow, look at them. They're amazing. I wish I could paint like that. It was really something aspirational, which is, it's like I was just saying to you earlier about coming back into Warhammer just over the past kind of few years, you know, after not playing for a while, and then seeing online the standard of painting and just what people are doing these days is scary. I mean, I go onto Instagram and my feed is just full of things that every single one of them, you know, 20, 25, 30 years ago would have been a Golden Sword winner.
Yeah, I did the video with Mike McVeigh on heavy metal, and
right.
I remember talking with him about the kind of standard of painting 30 years ago compared to nowadays, and, you know, even he was saying again, you know, like, you look at what people are posting on Instagram, and these are just, you know, hobbyists sat there, best painting. You know, and like you say, they could all be Golden Demon winners.
I think there's a lot of things going on there. You know, partly the internet just means people can learn more easily. You know, you can go and find tutorials and stuff. You don't need to. You know, White Dwarf is no longer the only source of information. Of course, techniques have developed a lot. You know, you've got so many different kinds of paints. Like I remember when I first started, red was so hard to paint just because you couldn't get a good quality red paint. Like the red color, and yellow was even worse. And I remember like the little hack that someone taught me when you get the red paint is just take the top off the red paint and leave it out for 2 days until it's almost completely dried and it turns into like this kind of thick gunk. But at least it gives you some coverage, because at the time, like acrylic reds were just, you couldn't get any coverage with them. So yeah, the materials, the techniques, everything has come along so much. But what's really interesting and really cool as well, though, is how, you know, I talk to some of the painters, the modern painters, and even if they're just hobbyists sometimes as well, but you know, like you said, they have this amazing standard. So many of them refer back to the heavy metal of the 90s, right? The heavy metal team of the 90s, to Mike McVeigh and all the rest of the crew. I think those guys are really like the unsung heroes of that era. You know, literally everyone that remembers that time talks of how they were inspired by that, how that was their start, like that was their aspiration, was to reach that kind of standard that they saw on the pages of heavy metal, even if, you know, they're far exceeding it these days. So that's really cool to see. And
like you said, you know, you get painters referring to articles that were written 30 years ago and like using that as their baseline kind of thing. And, you know, obviously the videos I've been doing, a lot of the content I cover is, you know, stuff that Games Workshop was doing 20, 30 years ago, not 5 years ago kind of thing. So there's a lot of people in that time period for sure.
Yeah, but I think also there was you know, when you don't have the kind of the tutorials and the materials and everything that we have these days, it kind of forces a level of artistry, right? I mean, Mike McVeigh was creating those techniques and doing that as he went along. I think there's a kind of artistry in that, and that the fact that you're having to make do with what you have and having to kind of like develop those techniques yourself. I'll just briefly mention one other article from this issue, because it's one of my all-time favorite articles. It's a scenario for, it's a kind of superhero scenario, superhero role-playing scenario, but it's just completely, it's kind of like this Terminator meets Dracula meets Frankenstein meets Sherlock Holmes. There's this premise where this kind of robot has traveled back in time. This killer robot has traveled back in time to the 19th century to assassinate someone, to affect things in the future. But then the players have to travel back in time to go and stop this robot. But then Dracula gets in the way, and Frankenstein turns up, and Sherlock Holmes comes along to help them out. And it's such complete craziness. And honestly, the article itself is so badly written, like you can hardly follow what's going on because it's just so badly laid out. But it captures that era so well. Like it captures my gaming youth so perfectly. That's how games were for us. It's just kind of like, Terminator just came out as a movie. I want to throw that into my Dungeons and Dragons game, but let's throw in all this other crazy stuff as well, and let's do it really badly. And that one article always stood out for me as being like such a perfect encapsulation of that era for me in terms of my gaming life. Okay, let's move on to another issue. What do I have next? Okay, number 3, let's go to issue 195. So, like I said, with issue 191, that was my first issue, Jake's first issue of Fat Dwarf. I think it took us a few months to kind of find our groove and really start, producing really great content. And I think 195 for me was the point where we kind of hit that, where we kind of found the groove. And I'm just looking through the contents here. There's so much great stuff there. Lovely heavy metal page. Rich Potter and Dave Perry painting some Necromunda stuff. We've got Jervis frothing about all kinds of stuff. And
yeah, I was looking at this issue a few days ago because I've just done a video with Jervis Johnson talking about some stuff, and in this issue is the 1996 Grand Tournament. So I was looking at it myself, this time last week, kind of thing. So
and 2 of my favorite articles here that I worked on. Well, one of my favorite battle report by far, and also one of my favorite non-battle report articles as well. So we have this article that we kind of wrote as a team. It's credited to Jake here, but actually we all worked on it. Ancient Writings. So it's about making up your own scenarios in Warhammer 40K and Epic, and just kind of breaking the mold a little bit. I think is the kind of thing that I think one of the big things that's been lost, or my perception of it is that it's been lost. I don't know what things are really like, just based on what you see online. Is this kind of like individual creative freedom with the games? People just kind of like taking it and doing their own crazy stuff with it. So much of it has to be, you have to follow the lore as is written in canon. You have to play the game as specified. You can't deviate. And I think this article is really kind of the opposite of that. This is an article about just saying, well, just do your own thing, huh? And specifically was look at history, take some ideas from history and use ideas from history just to kind of inspire yourself. So specifically what we've done is we've taken Custer's Last Stand, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and would said, what can you just take this idea, take this little piece of history, what can you do with this? How can you kind of do something fun with this, with Warhammer? And and then it was really fun just to see how different our 3 treatments had been at the end. And there was some really kind of crazy fun stuff that came out of that. And it was just hugely fun to write. And I remember as well that I was responsible for kind of laying out that article afterwards and kind of editing it. And it was a really hard article to do just because there was so much stuff that we wanted to put into it. And it's already a pretty long article. You know, this is like, I think probably the longest, it's as long as a battle report by the looks of it. And this was a struggle even to get it down to that much. You know, I can remember having some arguments with the team about what we should cut out to try and fit it into the space. Yeah, this was a really fun article to write, really fun article to work on. It's always nice when you're kind of doing things with other people in the team as well. You know, it's a little bit more of a team effort. And something that, again, I think kind of sums up a little bit how styles and approaches to gaming have changed over the past few decades. You know, this was the kind of stuff that was a lot more commonplace, I think, a few decades ago. The other really big one here that I loved is this battle report. Yeah, so we had me fighting against Gav, High Elves against Chaos. Gav was fun to play against anyway. Gav, you know, he didn't take games so seriously in the way that, you know, someone like Thomas or even 80 might. Not that it wasn't fun to play against Thomas and 80, but it was just, it's a different kind of fun. You know,
Yeah,
they're a bit more serious and focused about their gaming. Gav is a bit more kind of freewheeling, and so it was always fun to play against Gav. But this battle, I think it just had so many things that make a great battle report. First, it was just so cinematic. You know, we had we both had dragons, and we had this great scenery. We had the great table layout, and you know, and it just happened like that. We really didn't set it up. That we ended up with these 2 dragons fighting against each other on the top of this great piece of scenery in the middle. It just made for some fantastic photos. And a lot of the times with battle reports, so you have to have like kind of posed photos afterwards because you need the proper lighting and everything. And there was so little to do with this one. You know, it was really just kind of like taking what had been on the tabletop and moving it into the photo area and snapping it, you know, and it made great photos. So I loved how cinematic it was. That's always been for me like one of the biggest reasons for playing games. You know, a lot of people play competitively, they want to win, and a long time ago there was an aspect of that. A lot of people are into the lore and they want to play games to kind of like tell stories, and again, there's an aspect of that, and you know what motivates me. But what really motivates me to play is just the spectacle of it. You know, there's nothing beats just having a tabletop filled with minis and terrain everywhere, and just looking at it, you know, and just appreciating like the aesthetic of it. And so this was, you know, that battle was like the epitome of a Warhammer spectacle for me. On top of that, we had like this really nice little narrative where we wanted to see who was the greatest wizard in the Warhammer world, and so you know, we'd each take like a great wizard and fight it out and see who won. This was actually the second, I'm just remembering this now, this was the second time we fought that battle. It didn't happen often that we would, you know, fight a battle and then it decide it just wasn't suitable for battle report and refight it. This was probably the only time that I did that, certainly within the team. I think that was the only time that I did that. But the first time we played, I completely dismantled Gav. I was just he was wiped off the floor, and we just decided that would not be very. you know, we need something. So we went back and we both tweaked our army lists and made some adjustments, and which was definitely a good thing. We ended up with a much, much better battle coming out of it. I don't know where that narrative came from. I have a suspicion I may have written, I remember I wrote another article about magic and magical tactics. I think maybe in 1 or 2 issues before that. I could look back, but I'm pretty sure like maybe the issue before I'd written an article about magic, and I'd listed off the greatest wizards in the Warhammer universe, and we'd had like a discussion at that point about my ordering and who should be where. And so I think the whole idea had come about because of that, you know, that discussion there. But it was nice to have that kind of narrative. And was absolutely, there was, you know, zero marketing influence there. This was not a kind of, you know, push the new army or push this or push that. It was really just like, this was the battle we wanted to fight. On top of all that, it was like a really thrilling battle. Like it was right up until the edge, you know. If I remember off the top of my head, I've got it in front of me. It was like 2019 victory points at the end.
26, 25.
26-25, right?
So yeah, a close fought game for sure. And
then there was this crazy thing happened at the end that only required a tiny bit of fudging on our part to make happen, where there was one of Gav's heroes transformed into a kind of ravenous chaos beast in the last turn and gave him this opportunity, and it was like a kind of distant last chance, but didn't quite make it. So everything kind of came together in this battle report for me in terms of the narrative, the gameplay, the spectacle of it all, just playing with Gav, you know, which is fun as well. But that was just a really great article for me. I think also it wasn't my first battle report. I think, if I remember right, I'd only done one battle report before that, which had been against 80, an epic battle report against 80. And that one, I think just wasn't, it wasn't so much, it was more work and less fun just because I was learning how to do battle reports.
Yeah, that's something that AD talked about. Again, I did a video with him and he talked about the level of effort required into making a battle report. And you have to like remove yourself from having fun playing the game because you're ultimately, you know, doing a job kind of thing. So like, I can fully
yeah. So I think that the very first one I had against 80 was more that it was more work. It was, you know, learning how you note everything down and what you need to photograph and what you need to note and stuff like that. But I think by this point, again, you know, the team had moved on a little bit. Both Gav and I were a bit more experienced doing battle reports, so we were able to get into it a bit more and able to have a bit more fun with it. And that didn't happen often on battle reports. I mean, often it was you know, you were doing it for a purpose, right? More and more as I went on in the magazine, it wasn't often that we would do just that, just have like two members of the team fighting each other and doing the battle report, which was, you know, really nice and straightforward. You know, later on it was more, you know, you'd have other people from outside the team doing the battle, and then you'd just be there like reporting on it. Which is, you know, it's more work and less fun. Not that it wasn't fun still, but
yeah, you'd rather be playing.
yeah. So yeah, that was this whole issue. I think 195 is really a great issue. Some more heavy metal with Torben, Paul Muller there, and Kim. Rick writing stuff as well. It's always nice when Rick and Nigel, I think, are really like, for me, those two were a league above everybody else in terms of writing quality. I think Rick and Nigel had a real kind of wit and sparkle to their style that's really completely gone these days. I mean, these days it's you know, the grim dark has settled in, and that kind of the humor that Rick and Nigel and others as well, you know, I don't want to disregard everybody else from the era, but it's something that like you just don't really find so much these days. Anything written by Rick or Nigel, I'm always happy to see in an issue of Dwarf. let's drop back in time again, even further back in time this time, to issue 53. This was my actual first issue of White Dwarf, the first one I ever bought. I was trying to remember, I was looking through, I was sure it was in the 40s, but then I found this article that I remember very specifically. This article was the one that kind of introduced me to Warhammer. So again, like issue 53, the reason I bought it was for Dungeons and Dragons, right? I was a Dungeons and Dragons player at the time. I don't think I'd even heard of Warhammer. And then I opened up and there's this article presenting a Minas Tirith scenario for Warhammer First Edition. And that just was, again, one of those things that's just mind-blowing. I mean, this was really, it became like an aspirational thing for me. Partly discovering Warhammer. So this was like I went out and I started with first edition of Warhammer. I don't think I ever actually played any games of first edition, but it was the first edition that I owned. But even if I never played, the intention was to one day be able to play the Battle of
the same for many people, isn't it? Yeah, like you've been introduced to it, you've got the books, whether you've actually played it or not is irrelevant. You're in the IP now, aren't you? So
yeah. Well, even here, it's not even the IP, right? This is this is not. I think the Warhammer universe, as we know it now, barely existed at the time. It was a set of fantasy wargaming rules, which here is being, just being applied to create a Lord of the Rings scenario. Interestingly enough, at the time, it just seemed like, I looked at the army lists and it was kind of, okay, Gondor, I could see myself putting together a Gondor list. There's maybe 20, 30 miniatures in there. Or the Fellowship and Arrogance Forces list, there's, 30 odd minis there. The Rohirrim, that gets to be a bit of a stretch because there's a unit of 55 Rohirrim cavalry. And then you get to the Witch King of Angmar army list, and there's just hundreds of them. There's hundreds of orcs and different types of orcs and Haradrim and all of these. And so that was the kind of, okay, well, I can try one of those forces and maybe I can find somebody else who'll be, And the thing is, as well, at the moment, at that time, my entire collection of minis it was not a wargaming collection. It was a role-playing collection. It was in Dungeons and Dragons minis. And so what I had to represent there was more like, I had a wood elf that could be Legolas. I had a wizard who could be Gandalf. Actually, is Gandalf even in there? I'm not sure Gandalf is there, huh? Yeah, he's there. Yeah. So it's kind of like, yeah, maybe I can do something here. So that was that was my first introduction to Warhammer. That's really where it all started, was that one article. I think second edition came out not long after that. I didn't have first edition for long before I bought second edition, and that would be my first ever actual game. So my first ever game there was not even playing with metal minis. And if you remember the second edition box set came with these cardboard cutout standees. So it was playing with photocopied standees that playing on the. We didn't have a table big enough to play a game on, so it was played on the floor in the garage, and we used chalk to draw out the battlefield. We had no terrain, so we just hand drew forests and rivers on the battlefield to be our terrain. And I don't think the first game we even ever actually finished. I'm not sure we even, got everything set up, and then it was like, hey, you have to come for dinner now, and that was it. It was over. So that was the very first game, and then after that, it was playing with, we got some Prince August molds. Do you remember those? Those cast yourself at home, melt your own super toxic lead. I don't know how my parents ever let us do that, high temperature toxic metals. Yeah, fine, go ahead. So it cast our own minis. And we just had maybe 4 or 5 molds. So it was armies of wood elves and wizards on one side against trolls and skeletons with skeleton catapults on the other side. And that was like our first games. It was we played like that, which was cool. Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, it's very DIY.
Yeah. It's again kind of like a shame that you don't see that kind of stuff so much again these days. Like sometimes I see in some of my Facebook groups, there's dads who play with their kids using Lego figurines instead of miniatures, and it's great to see people doing stuff like that.
Yeah, I've seen there's a guy on Reddit I've seen who does like origami, and he does like Space Marines like as origami, like really poor quality. I don't mean to diminish them; they are like really basic, but the principle is there. And he's like, why would I spend 40 quid for 5 Space Marines when I can just make these and have the same amount of fun? So
yeah. So it's always like it always feels kind of like a little bit sad when people say that they want to get into the hobby but they feel they can't afford it because everything's so expensive. And it's kind of, yes, it's expensive if you're going to do it the way that you see like Instagram is doing it, where you have like huge armies and everything's painted to a huge to super high standard. Just go on eBay and buy a box of old bits, or just improvise with whatever you have. Use standees, print out some standees and play with those. I think it's another one of those things that's kind of been lost over time, and there's a good side to that, and that we have these incredible miniatures, and we have like these incredible stuff that you can find on Instagram. But at the same time, it feels like some of that spirit from when it all started has been lost a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so then we're on to the old time, my favorite ever issue of White Dwarf. White Dwarf issue number 200. So here, this was, if I remember right, this issue was super fat. For the kind of the issue 200 special, we got even some extra pages in there, which was, it was, working on Dwarf was hard work. I think probably professionally, over the course of those years, was probably the hardest I've been worked. Afterwards in video games, you get into crunch, but crunch is kind of like, it's limited. It's the end of a production cycle. So you have those few weeks or those few months sometimes where, you're working super hard. White Dwarf, that was persistent. You have these deadlines to reach every 4 weeks. You have to deliver. And then as soon as you deliver, the next one starts. So there's this constant pressure to keep delivering stuff. So then when you have to do even more pages and you have to deliver even more content, this was very possibly the hardest worked issue that I was ever involved in. And a little bit you can see that in the issue, right? So I think at one point, we have the Meet the Dwarfers article, which was 100% pure page filler. It's like, we've got to put something in all these pages. What can we do that's going to be quick and easy? So we all just wrote very brief bios, filled up 2 pages with our own personal bios. But it was still kind of fun to do. And even now, even today, I still get people referencing my bio from that issue of Dwarf. People asking me how they can win a picture of a fish. And it's really it's touching, that people remember those little tiny things. Like, it's a little bit weird that after about a 30-year-long career now, and when people remember and think back on my career, the first thing that comes up is some dumb joke about winning a picture of a fish. But there you go. It's my fault for writing it. But apart from the page fillers, and even the page fillers are fun, huh? This was still such a great issue. Starting with the cover. Wayne, so it would be difficult if you were to ask who was the greatest artist in Games Workshop history. You can't really say anyone other than John Blanche. But Wayne England is a very close second for me. I mean, his work is magnificent. I think nothing sums up Wayne's work better than the cover of White Dwarf issue 200. I remember seeing it as he was working on it, because the artist room was just upstairs from the dwarf area, so we'd have to go through there from time to time. And seeing that piece of work develop was just so inspiring, and such a privilege as well, really, to be able to see not just that final piece of work, but to see it, being worked on, to see it developing. And Wayne's such an incredibly lovely guy as well, a really wonderful guy, so nice and kind, and I think it's probably worth saying as well that it really was a privilege to be in the studio at that time. There was so much talent there. I think in the 30 years that I've been working, I've worked in a lot of places with a lot of incredible talent. There's never been such a concentration of talent in one place as during those years that I was on White Dwarf and surrounded by the teams there. You've got John Blanche, Wayne England, Dave Gallagher, all these kind of household names amongst Warhammer aficionados, household names, but really legendary artists. Mike McVeigh, we've already mentioned. Figure sculptors like the Perry twins.
I think you summed it up early when you were saying, like, at that kind of period in White Dwarf's history, it was you were somewhat left to your own devices, and whatever you thought was cool, you could print. There was no kind of ulterior motive. So if everyone just wanted to do cool stuff, and it sold. So
yeah, that was an incredible time to be there. So yeah, starting with the cover, that was just the cover on its own is also almost enough for me to make this one of my favorite ever issues of White Dwarf. And then again, we have Nigel writing about the history of the White Dwarf. And I adore Nigel's writing. This is pretty close to my White Dwarf dream team. So we have Jake as editor, 80 as production editor, and then me, Gav, Ian, and Thomas. I think my actual dream team, I'd add in Mark as well, Mark Brendan. I think us 6 there plus Mark Brendan would have been my real White Dwarf dream team. I think pretty much everyone from that team was gone within a couple of years of this issue, though. Jake, of course, got moved on to other things in the studio. 80 stuck it out for a while longer, not a huge amount.
He was there for about 25 years, I think, altogether. He worked for Black.
He moved off White Dwarf, though. He moved on to other
he was on the website for a while and Black Library.
Gav, Ian, and Thomas, I think all 3 of those moved up to game development not long after they moved kind of off White Dwarf. I think Paul took over probably about a couple of years after this issue, I guess. Paul took over, I'm not sure, around 215, 220, maybe somewhere around there. But then he took over with almost a completely new crew. I think 80 was the only person that really stuck around for long with Paul. But then, so I think that was, this is the crew that kind of defines my personal golden age. Us 6 plus Mark. I would throw Mark in there as well. I thought Mark would have started by issue 200. I guess he started a little bit after. Then we have an interview with Wayne as well, an interview with Wayne England. It's a lovely Tales from the Underhive, one of the Papa Steve articles. And this is probably my favorite Papa Steve article as well. My Necromunda persona. It's actually interesting because I kind of became the Necromunda guy on the magazine just by chance. The point that I joined the company, or the point that I joined the magazine rather, was just after Necromunda launched. And so, of course, by the time the game launches, the studio's already been playing it for a year. So everyone had already been playing. Everyone was kind of like getting a little bit bored, moving on to the next thing. And Necromunda, for me, just coming in, it was just being released. I was just discovering it, so it was kind of the new cool thing. So I was kind of like designated the Necromunda, the Necromunda person. So a lot of those Necromunda articles ended up falling on me, which was a little bit weird because Necromunda was never really my favorite game. I really loved the lore. I really loved the minis as well. And the game itself was cool, but it just engaged me in the same way that it's exactly like I was saying earlier about the reason that I play is for the spectacle of it. Having like these big armies on the table. And Necromunda just is the antithesis of a mini game that provides spectacle, right? Because when you play it, if you're playing it well, you can't even see the minis. Everyone's like hiding everything away so they can't be shot, and it's hard to tell the difference between two good Necromunda players playing a game and just a table full of scenery. So I'm not knocking it as a game at all. Like I liked it as a game. I enjoyed it. The lore was incredible. The minis were incredible, but it never really captured me. It never really captured my spirit in the same way that the bigger games did. But nonetheless, I ended up being the Necromunda guy, and then this kind of persona developed, the Papa Steve thing. It came about, I'm not sure exactly who coined it. It came about for two reasons. One was my first gang was made up entirely of Jews. So it was just the gang leader and the Jews. And so that's how kind of like the Papa bit came. So it was Papa Steve and the Burger Boys. My gang was called the Burger Boys because I'd made this piece of scenery. And it was made from the ends of a couple soda bottles with some corrugated cardboard in between. And they were like sandwiched in between to look like a big burger. And then it was kind of like painted yellow and had drips of PVA glue. It had come from another White Dwarf article. It was an article about making terrain for the Judge Dredd miniature game, like years and years before. But anyway, I'd made this piece of terrain to represent one of my territories in the game. And so that was like, those things came together to get the name. And then it just kind of stuck. And those articles were always fun to write, the Papa Steve articles. But this was probably, again, this is like we were just talking about those historical scenarios. This was very much the same kind of thing with the Tales from the Underhive. So this was taking inspiration from low-budget horror movies for making scenarios for Necromunda. I mean, Necromunda has that kind of low-budget horror movie feel to it a lot of the time.
It does, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And again, here you can see there's a bunch of things here that you'll never be able to get away with these days. And I think partly like openly saying that you're being inspired by someone else outside of the Games Workshop universe, and writing a whole article about I wrote some really nice lines here. I'd never be able to write anything like this nowadays. Old black and white movies are always being shown on the late night television, although you should only bother with the horror and science fiction movies, ignoring the Cary Grant comedy romances and subtitled French art house flicks. And these can give you some great plot ideas. Yeah, this kind of stuff was always fun to work on. There was even some little things here that were kind of, there's a photograph. So I'm looking here on page 44. There's a photograph there where you have a lictor with a ganger. There's no way you would be able to see something like that nowadays, kind of like this mixing of systems. I think even back in the day, that was a little bit contentious. I think you probably had to do some convincing to get that photo in there. Actually, that's also an interesting photo because it's not at all like a White Dwarf standard photo. I mean, usually everything was kind of very prescribed. The lighting, the way the lights were positioned, the camera settings, everything was kind of very tightly prescribed, and you can see that everything is very uniform in feel. And that photo has not been taken with those kind of prescribed settings. You can see there's kind of like a directional light there. It's a little bit more moody. It's a little bit more of a kind of narrative photo rather than a photo just to show off the minis. So there you go. That's my all-time 5 favorite issues of White Dwarf.